This is the second lesson on the Sermon on the Mount. In this video, we cover Matthew 5, verses 11 through 16, being prophets, salt, and light. So last time we looked at the Beatitudes, and you notice that the Beatitudes are all in the third person. We talk about people who realize their need for God, the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the pure in heart, and people who help others, the gentle, the merciful, the peacemakers, those who do right by others. In verses 11 through 16, Jesus directly addresses his disciples, which for us now would be believers in Jesus, Christ followers. Here's what he says. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So let's walk through each of these verses. He starts with, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. So who are you? If you remember how this chapter began, Jesus called his disciples to him. So this is spoken directly to the disciples. In verse 10, the verse immediately before this, which is the 8th beatitude, Jesus says that persecution can come from doing what is right. In verse 11, this verse, he says you can be insulted, persecuted, and lied about just because you are a Christ follower. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Rejoice and be glad, that seems like a peculiar way to respond to persecution. But Jesus gives us two reasons for why you should do this. One is that great is your reward in heaven. It's not like this goes unrewarded. But the second thing is almost more important. He says, you are having a prophetic impact. The same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So you're the current prophets. Later in Matthew, when Jesus sends out the 12 disciples, which is described in Matthew 10, almost the entire chapter, he really expands this whole idea. So he sends out the disciples, and he tells them, go do awesome stuff. Expect to be supported. Don't take a lot of stuff with you, or go out and you have to raise all the money for your ministry. He says, expect to stir up trouble. Everyone is not going to like your message. But do not be afraid. And you and those who support you will be rewarded. You're having a prophetic impact. This awesome stuff is healing and everything else that goes with it. I like a quote from actually a non-Christian, Mahatma Gandhi. Sometimes he seems to understand us better than we understand ourselves. He said about his life, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's the expectation of a Christian. Verse 13 begins, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, I read this, and it's a very familiar saying. This is passed into just general use in English. What does Jesus mean by this? And because it's a common phrase, you can actually look it up in the regular dictionary. So we look up the dictionary definition. The common meaning of salt of the earth is a very good and honest person, according to Webster's dictionary. But somehow, I don't think this is what Jesus meant. So let's think some about what it means to be salt. In the time of Jesus, salt was a very valuable commodity. And you look throughout history, early Roman soldiers were paid in salt. This is where we get the word salary. The Greeks traded salt for slaves. And we get the phrase worth his salt actually comes from this slave trade. And in the time of Jesus, there were no refrigerators. So salt was used as a preservative to preserve food. And it's throughout history has been one of the most effective and widely used preservatives. This is so taken for granted in the Bible that salt was used to signify an everlasting covenant between God and his people in certain ceremonies, described in both Numbers and Chronicles. Sacrifices to God in the Old Testament were to be salted, to be preserved. Salt was used as an antiseptic. You could actually clean things with salt water. So it's used to purify and clean. And of course, the way we usually think of salt is a seasoning. So it's used to season food. So if this is what salt is used for, preserve, to be an antiseptic, to seasoning, then it doesn't seem like a stretch to say that what Jesus meant was that Christians exist in the world to preserve, purify, and season society. And notice how he puts it. He says, we are, not should be, salt of the earth. And we're not a salt, we're the salt. We are the thing in the world to preserve, purify, and season it. And of the earth, so of the entire planet. He's saying a very important thing about the role of Christians on the whole planet. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, I looked up the word that's translated here as loses its saltiness. And literally, the Greek word means to make foolish, to taint, to make useless. In the first chapter of Romans, it says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools." The became fools is the same Greek word that's translated in Matthew as loses its saltiness. So Christians lose our saltiness when we quit living as if Jesus Christ matters. And if we tie this back into the Beatitudes, we forget our need for God and his righteousness. We cease to be the people who make a difference, the gentle, the merciful, the peacemakers, those who do right by others. And we become fools, tainted, not salty, good for nothing. Then Jesus changes to a different metaphor. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. And again, it's not you can be, you will be, it's you are, and not a light, You are the light of the world, parallel to what he said about salt. And this Greek word for world is actually cosmos. You're the light of the cosmos, the world, the universe. Now we're familiar with all the passages in the New Testament talks about that Jesus is the light of the world. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And the implication here is that Jesus passes this light on to us. We're filled with this light. And the light of your life will show. That's the whole idea. As salt, you make a difference in what you do. As light, you point people to the why and the how. And that's the intention. So Jesus says, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus intends for people to see that you're different in how you live your life. And this difference should point them to God, not to ourselves. Yeah, 1 Peter, it says, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. And we can contrast this to what Jesus will say in the next chapter of Matthew, where he warns, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. The idea here is that there's a difference between your witness, which should point to God, and just pride in your righteousness. I want to be the center of attention, the Christian big noise. Everything you do should not point to you, but be pointing to God, the reason you are like you are. So if we summarize what we learned in this passage, one is that we have a prophetic mission. We're here for a reason, to live a life that has impact and significance. And the salt is all about moral courage and actions in a world of decay. We are to make a difference. And light is about speaking truth to a world in darkness. We are called for both. That is our prophetic mission.